So we want to talk a little bit more about this definition of socialism and kind of the history of socialism, where the thinking comes from, and then kind of apply that as we go through the rest of the day to some case studies that this Fraser Institute did the background work on, and pick off a few countries from around the world and say, okay, what do we find there? So let's start off with this socialism defined. The idea of socialism, it's as old as time itself. And the idea is to eradicate want from the human experience. Who wants to worry about where the next meal's coming from? Who wants to worry about what kind of car they're going to buy? Nobody wants to worry about that. And so we're going to eradicate it. That's kind of the idea of socialism, and this unequalness that we sometimes feel in our economy, whether it be nationally or internationally. And so some of the ideas are equity and plenty, that we'll all have enough, we'll have it evenly with the distribution of goods, money, and services. Some people trace this all the way back to passages in the Bible, to Aristotle. The idea is literally as old as time itself. But buried in the middle of this is an assumption about the abundance of goods and services. It's easy to say that everybody gets the same, but we also want there to be this plenty along with the equity. And so, where do those goods and services come from? How do they get produced so that there's not only an equal distribution, but that we all have essentially everything we want? The early writings about socialism were really about utopian socialism or utopian societies. There are a number of writers that I'm sure many of you have read all or parts of. One of the more famous was Sir Thomas More. And I'll let you take a second and read what's on the screen there. And the word utopia literally means no place, that there's no place like that now for those writers that were writing about it. But take a minute and read on there. Now, some things to pull out of there real quick. Start with the last line. For what can make a man so rich as to lead a serene and cheerful life, free from anxieties? Um, this utopian feeling of, yeah, let's take that heavy burden of life off of us. A couple of other things that he puts in here that I think are worth pulling out. There is no unequal distribution. So that idea of some kind of equal distribution has survived over time. But one of the things I like with Sir Thomas More's quote here is, um, they all know that if care is taken to keep the public stores full, no private man can want for anything. But this notion of keep the public stores full, the successful socialism assumes that there is plenty to go around, which of course is in direct conflict to much of economists' writing, who focus on scarcity and that there's never enough to go around. And so, this idea of a utopian existence, and we even started some utopian communities. Let me back up. Well, that's all right. We'll leave that. Some new hope. I believe it's in Indiana, was started, and most of these utopian writers saw that people would voluntarily come together and enter into a utopian sort of government focused on this equal distribution, seeking this serenity and escape from anxieties. and that it would be voluntary and that it would spread from small communities to larger ones. And that's not what we've seen happen. Karl Marx came along with what I would call modern socialism at this point. And Marx, he moved the focus from a utopian socialism to what he called a scientific socialism. And in scientific socialism, he said, look, it is a predictable outcome of capitalism and a stage on the way to communism. So he took human development and broke it into stages, and that we all would pass through this capitalist stage into a socialism stage and on to a communist stage. Thus the idea that it's scientific socialism, because it's inescapable in um, sort of the march of time in humanity. uh, One of the things that Marx wrote, which is important, and he recognized that capitalism was capable of massive and colossal forces of production. And that's why capitalism was one of the necessary stages in what he saw as his scientific development of socialism, because capitalism had to create this abundance of goods and services that were to be distributed equally. And without that abundance, only poverty could be distributed equally, not plenty and goods and services. Capitalism, he thought, would lead to stagnation, inequality, materialistic oppression, all of many of the things we hear today, and eventually crisis and revolt, which would take us to communism. But he saw that all of this march of history would be an ongoing clash of classes. As he says here, the path to socialism proceeds not through the establishment of model communities, the utopian societies, that set examples of harmonious cooperation to the world, but through the clash of social classes. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle, a very different look than the utopian writers. And much of what we tend to draw as the definition of socialism today, I believe, comes from Marx's interpretation more than those utopian writers. In that clash of the classes, he saw that a socialist revolution against capitalism would ultimately lead to communism, where there would be a classless society. So, what does socialism mean today? We go back to the quiz that you just took, some of the definitions you came up with, and looking at writers around the world and listening to politicians, we get things like societal and economic equality with a relatively high standard of living. Anytime I see somebody in today's world writing about socialism or talking about socialism, there is an underlying assumption that it's going to be with a high standard of living. And that's an assumption that I don't think we can make. And Marx didn't make it. He said capitalism's got to come first to create that abundance of goods and services, that colossal and massive creation of wealth. We do see that government control of most, if not all, industry and property gets into all of our definitions, it seems. That some sort of central planning of the economy shows up in our definitions, and that somehow we will create a fair and gentler society that will take away those anxieties. So we circle all the way back to those utopian writers, and almost tend to talk of socialism in a reverent way, that there's a better way, a fairer and gentler way. So what does socialism mean today to economists? Socialism is not a 0-1 designation. That is, that you either have it or you don't have it. But rather, it's whether a country or industry is socialist is a question of degree, to which one, the means of production, distribution, and exchange are owned or regulated by the state. So the means of production and distribution are owned or regulated, could be either one. And we saw in many of your definitions that these showed up in different ways. Or B, the state uses its control to distribute the economic output without regard for final consumers' willingness to pay or exchange. So that the state takes on and controls the distribution, but does not necessarily own the means of production. Economics of Socialism, historically, writers in favor of socialism, they've argued that economies leads to income, wealth, and inequality through the exploitation of primarily workers, and that this can be remedied if we simply have public ownership so there are no private owners who are taking advantage of workers. Inequality rises in the marketplace because it's a zero-sum game. That is, socialism assumes that if I get it, somebody else doesn't. And so therefore it was denied to someone else or it was taken away from someone else. And that's where the equality comes from. And I think it's important to look at this last part of that sentence, that workers are paid according to the power they possess rather than their marginal products. In a market economy, which we mostly live in, we're paid for our marginal product. If we produce more in some way, we tend to get more, whether it's we produce more because we work harder, we work smarter, we create new goods or services. That is our marginal output, and we get paid for it. Um, but those proponents of socialism say if Ken Leonard gets more, somebody else in this class has to get less. That's a big difference between looking at capitalism and socialism. Mao described this ruthless exploitation and political oppression of the peasant and landlord class. Bernie Sanders, uh, he says large corporations, and we've heard this if we've had the television set on, exploit human misery and insecurity and turn them into huge profit. So again, this notion of exploitation. And Elizabeth Warren, giant corporations exploit workers just to boost their own profits. So this theme of exploitation of the workers persists as we turn our look at socialism. State ownership is less visible aspect of modern American socialism. So, are we a socialist country or are we not a socialist country? And if we tend to look at things like private ownership of property, we're very much a private property country. We can own things, we can exclude others from the use of those things. But does that mean that we are not socialist? And I think this is an important one to think about. We won't dwell on it a lot today, but socialists, in most instances today, would allow individuals to be legal owners of capital and their labor. Now, I don't know that that would extend to if we want to put the tag of communist on it. But in a socialist country, we do, in most cases, still have legal ownership of capital and labor. But the economic significance of ownership is control over the use of an asset and the income it generates rather than the legal title by itself. So you have to put in there the question of, even though I own it, do I control it? I just happened to turn on the news last evening and saw President Trump sitting at a table with a number of dignitaries and citizens in Southern California and talking about the fires and the process that lay ahead to rebuild. And this very thing was a strong part of the discussion. And that is, even though I did own the house that burned down and own the property it's set on, I don't feel like I control it because of the laws in place. So it's not just ownership, it's also that control. In short, the value of an asset is sharply diminished in the economic sense if the legal owner has little control over the use. And again, I heard that in that press conference. One of the people said, I still own oceanfront property, but I feel like it's worth nothing because I can't decide what to do with it. I can't rebuild on it. So that's kind of a quick look at where we've gotten to with socialism. It lines up with the definitions that you all gave in the activity with Debbie. So why can't why can't it why can't we seem to get it right historically in any of the countries where it's been tried? And the answer to that is that there are some unsolved challenges of socialism that we need to keep in mind, uh, both as we consider the term socialism, but also as we look at some of the countries that we're going to hear in a few minutes. What are those unsolved challenges? One is control of citizens, that is, including their wants and desires. I to be successful socially as socialism, we have to control the wants and desires. We can't serve everybody's absolute individual need of human desires and human interactions, the knowledge of what's going on out there. The first, control, it it leads to restricting individual choices. The second, unsolved challenge of knowledge, says, do I know enough? Do the central planners know enough to satisfy those wants and needs of the citizens? What will we distribute? For as simple a question as, would you like vanilla or chocolate ice cream? Would you like wheat or soy? How do the planners figure out what kind of ice cream Ken Leonard wants? And what if I change my flavor tomorrow? Do we have a mechanism to keep us smart enough, knowledgeable enough to meet the needs of the individual citizens? Third problem or challenge are incentives. Under socialism, individuals and planners, they're not incentivized to serve the general interest. None of us really are. Our primary incentive is to serve ourselves. That's not to say our primary interest is to be selfish. It means that our primary interest is to pursue those things we value, which may or may not be the public interest. And then the last is the pathologies of privilege. Uh, as the control is centralized, so is the power in any socialist state. There's an equal distribution of goods and services, but because of the bureaucracy it takes to try to bring that about, the power is concentrated among only a few, uh, relatively speaking, individuals who are in some way privileged over others. And no communist experiment or socialist experiment through time has been able to solve uh, those uh, challenges. So looking at those a little bit with the control, and here we can branch out beyond just a single country, but a number. But where's the largest experiment of socialism ever been carried out? It is in the Soviet Union, of course. And we have lots of examples all through the Soviet Union, which includes not just Russia, but Poland and uh, a number of other countries that fell under the USSR banner. So to control the economy, you have to control the people. It will eventually move to a more totalitarian state. Does that happen in the US as we move to control wants, desires, choices of individuals in the economy? Does it feel like it's moving to a more totalitarian state? And for state to control property, it has to eliminate private property. Uh, and again, that doesn't mean it has to own it. It has to eliminate private property. And you can do that by putting the restrictions for use on my property to the point that I no longer control it, because the ownership and control go together. These are just some pictures and examples of control that come out of the Soviet Union, uh, where it really was to take away the individualism. Um, this one is an interesting quote by Thomas Sowell, a economist that did a lot of writing on this, particularly through the 90s. And he says society. John Rawls was a uh, more of a socialist writer, and Sowell was saying Rawls should refers to things society should arrange, and Sowell says interior decorators arrange, governments compel, and it's not a subtle distinction. Uh, so it's very difficult for the government to arrange unless the government compels. Adam Smith, he referred to it as looking at the economy or society uh, as a chessboard, and that the the planners, the central planners, could move the chess pieces wherever they felt was best. But the problem was that the chess pieces in a real society want to move on their own. And so the only way to keep them in place is to control them. The knowledge, information is dispersed, it's not centralized. Information cannot flow as fast through bureaucracies and official processes as it needs to. And without market prices, resources are not going to be directed to their highest valued use. Again, listening to the 10 or 15 minutes of the president's news conference in California, you heard all of those things in frustration by the landowners because they think that the system is being inhibited uh, by the central planning. And the last is incentives in terms of those challenges. Um, Power and position rather than profits become an incentive. Planners are incentivized for their own interest, not those of the population. What begins to happen, that middle bullet is probably the most detrimental in an economy in its pursuit of abundance, and that is that there is no incentive for innovation and invention. We'll simply do it as we did in the past. Because there are no prices as we know them, as market prices. They are what we call administered prices. And you soon spend your time, your energy, and your ingenuity trying to beat the system rather than increasing production and growth, rather than increasing that abundance. One of the things that developed throughout the Soviet Union and in Poland is this example, the nomenclature, These were the privileged few. These were the ones who had made it up the bureaucratic ladder, if you will. And look at the privileges and outcomes that they received that were not of equal distribution. Access to luxury summer resorts and spas, exclusive health care, special retirement, special passports, shopped at special reserve stores. There's a picture of one of those. And they were even exempt from paying taxes. They used their position and privilege to uh, use the system to their advantage. And the result of that was the Poland socialist economy turned everyday Poles into people who had to cheat, steal, and lie to secure their living day to day, uh, each day. So I'll give you just a minute to read through a couple of those. These kind of grayed out slides, the ones that say realities of socialism on them, they all come from the Fraser materials. They're yours to use from either this presentation or from the website itself. But as you read that, you can see that the system itself begins to corrupt the people. And this is where there is a great diversion from the original utopian writers who felt like socialism would make people better, that the system itself would make them kinder and gentler. And that has not been the case. Markets are different. Markets that do have prices, wants, desires expressed by individuals through purchasing choices, not through bureaucratic channels. Prices, profits, losses emerge from free choices of people exchanging their property rights. They have the freedom to do so. And I think the most important here, resources are moved to their highest valued use by prices, which allows for sorting out of viable versus feasible projects. If we've done any reading at all about the former Soviet Union, you can't escape stories that unfortunately are not just stories. They're a recounting of silly, not viable projects, even though they were feasible, they could do them, but they didn't respond to the needs of the marketplace. Innovation and changes in products and patterns of production are called out by market prices. Primary function of a market, which socialism does not provide, the primary market of prices is to provide information to buyers and sellers. Market prices bring millions of self-interested individuals into cooperative action. That's an interesting one. And Friedrich von Hayek, that's a quote from him and early writing in economics. It brings us together and it provides an incentive for individuals who don't really care about others to act as if we do care about others. I don't want the gas station owner to tell me I can't pump his gas, and he doesn't want me to say I'll never buy my gas there. So we're pretty cordial to each other. I don't know him at all. So that's kind of a quick look at socialism. Let's go and take a look at Poland as a case study. Poland's an interesting study in the fact that it moved from a fairly robust free market economy in the 20s and early 30s to communism coming out of World War II to socialism as it really behaved more like a socialist country under the communist rule, and now has made its way back to being a free market economy with a fairly robust and wealthy economic output. So hang on, we're going to have a quick history of the Soviet Union and look at the events that have impacted it. And you historians in the crowd, you can help me out either in the chat uh, if I get some things wrong. This is a timeline. This timeline is provided in the again. These materials are from the Fraser information. These timelines are provided in their information. 1939, Germany invades Poland from the west. Soviet Union invades from the east, and it is essentially divvied up between the Poles and the Germans. But then immediately, almost just a short time, Germany invades USSR, ends the non-aggression pact, and Germany, or excuse me, yeah, Germany takes over uh, Poland throughout the World War II. But then in 1944, the Soviet army re-enters Poland as the war is coming to an end, and the Communist Polish Committee of National Liberation is established. Uh, World War II ends. We go to the conference at Yalta, and the Soviets are given control over Poland, where they establish a provisional government. And it is provisional because the Soviets are still in charge. During that occupation of both the Germans and then the Soviets, you can see the tremendous cost that Poland paid down here in the bottom. 6 million dead, 340,000 deported, 500 million of industrial equipment sent to the USSR. The USSR said, hey, Germany built some of that equipment, or they had ownership of it at the end of 1944 when we reinvaded, and therefore it's ours now. Uh, the They marched a number, and some of you are familiar with this story, a number of the Polish army uh, to the Soviet Union, shot them, buried them in mass graves because they did not want the independence of those people, of those soldiers within the population. 30th, over a third of the pre-war assets are destroyed. Over a third of the rail lines are destroyed. So as we enter the late 40s, the early 50s, Poland is quite damaged, if you will, in a variety of ways. Let's see here. How come I'm not going forward? Because I'm not on my screen. Hang on. Whoops. Okay. Why is my next slide? Debbie, are you still sitting there? Oh, there we go.
I'm here.
Okay, I got it. It froze up. So it led to totalitarianism in Poland, just like it did everywhere else in the former Soviet Union. Here are some of the results of that. When we talk about that issue of control, 84,000 Poles sent to forced labor camps. 13,000 Polish Jews were given one-way tickets to leave and not return. That is a significant number because Poland actually had a fairly small Jewish population. They were primarily a Catholic country. And these numbers here in 1952, 50,000 political prisoners, 34,000 secret police with 26,000 informants. And that all goes back to control, control, control. In 81, there were some protests, but martial law was imposed, and we'll see that as we go along our timeline. Who suffered? The consumers suffered. The Polish people suffered. Um, Here's the 1980s, 15 to 30-year wait for housing. Only 7% of the population in the 80s had telephones, and only 11% had cars. Um, Polish people had comparatively lower incomes. You can see there, Poland on the left in 85, and United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, United States. So they were poor. They did not have an abundance to distribute equally, and they were under significant control because of the bureaucracy that was put in place. Um, they were very inefficient, in part because the incentives were not right for efficiency. That innovation and invention, there was no incentive to do it better because your marginal product was not rewarded. Just because you did it better didn't mean you got any more. So this graph depicts what it took, the value of what it took to produce steel in Poland versus the other countries of the world. So it took far more steel to create output than it did in other countries. Terribly inefficient. Um, it's interesting to me today. Again, if you're watching the evening news, and we're in places, some places still in Eastern Europe, but just the other night there were shots in Gaza, and there's people pulling horse-drawn carts down main roads because that's what their level of efficiency for a number of people is. We would never think of that happening here as a way to produce goods and services because it's too costly. And for Poland, it was very costly in the efficiency. Back to our timeline, jumping into the 1980s. Remember, martial law was declared. There started to be unrest. There were some food riots. Uh, the Solidarity Trade Union was formed in the shipyards within a year. It had 10 million members. Uh, and in response to widespread hunger or demonstrations, you can see circled there their hunger just uh, excuse me demonstrations. But probably one of the most significant things for Poland's history is that in '87, Gorbachev, uh, the premier of the Soviet Union, of course, he announced his withdrawal of 500,000, a half a million Soviet troops from Central and Eastern Europe, signaling the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine was a thing that Brezhnev put in place that said if you uh, abandon communism, and a broad interpretation of that, of the ways you can abandon communism, uh, we will invade you, we will um, fully take over your country. And at the time, Poland still tried to consider itself independent. It had moved from the first sort of provisional government really being Soviet military people put in places of government offices. But by the late 80s, there are Poles in charge, but they are beholding to the Soviet Union, and very much because of this Brezhnev doctrine that says, keep straight with communism or you will be invaded. 1988, the Polish government actually sits down with the 10 million plus members of Solidarity and begins some preliminary talks with them. In 89, those talks are formalized, and the trade unions create the office, or the country creates the office of president, and forms a legislature uh, to rule the country. I got to back up here a minute. I think, no, I just thinking I hit two of these. Um, Through this process, uh, there was one economist by the name of Lang, whose ideas were ignored, and another by the name of Balcerowitz, who came up with an economic plan. And in 1980, he was in the Polish government, had been installed essentially as Secretary of the Treasury, if you will. And he was able to implement a number of reforms that came from a document called the Washington Consensus. We're going to skip a couple of these. You can see the continuing impact. This life expectancy, is probably one of the most telling. It is a surrogate that we use around the world for how are you doing economically. You take a look at the life expectancy because it not only tells you about how long people are living, it tells you how rapidly they are dying. And so it really, if you dig into it, reflects your ability to provide clean living, clean water, adequate food, medical assistance, etc., because it reflects the slowdown of a death rate as well as an increase in a birth rate. Uh, Number of cars per thousand of people, you can see again, Poland way down at the bottom of even the Eastern European countries of the Soviet Union. Waiting for telephone service. Whoops, I missed the top of that. This is a percentage. This is out of 100. So in Poland, 57% of the people were waiting for telephone service. Um, in Now, Balcerowitz introduced his economic plan. It was rejected, but the movement toward an independent Poland continued into 1990, and Walensky is elected president of Poland. Uh, Balcerowitz, he stays as deputy prime minister of finance. And it's important because we're going to see his list of reforms here in just a minute and how they move the economy from the socialist to a more capitalist economy. This circled piece in the middle is kind of interesting because it's one we don't think about a lot. And that is, how do you transfer, if there really is government ownership of private property, and you want to go back to a more capitalist approach where individuals own the private property, how do you transfer all of that wealth back to the citizens? Um, and the way they did it was to create shares in what they call the National Investment Fund, which was the value of those privately held assets, or excuse me, publicly held assets, and distribute them back to the individuals. And the individuals could sell them, they could hold on to them and hope there was a return, but it was the way they chose to transfer power. Um, and the economic recovery really begins as that private property is transferred, and then uh, the recovery really begins to take place in 1992. The Washington Consensus, a number of the more developed economies in the world looked at the former Eastern Bloc countries and said, what is it going to take? What is it going to take for them to recover and transition from a socialist to a market economy? In Poland's case, back to a market economy. And this was the list of things that Washington consensus came up with. And I'll just give you a minute to read through there. You can see the privatization of state enterprises, uh, competitive exchange rates, competitive in the sense of being able to compete with the rest of the world. And the first one up there, as we will see both in Poland's story and later on in Sweden's story, fiscal discipline becomes important. Here's our man Balcerowicz. Here were his 7 primary actions that he took as the Deputy Minister of Finance. He ended price controls, let the market determine prices, lowered the barriers to foreign trade. This is one we're still working through in the United States today. Tariffs, a good thing or a bad thing? Eliminated restrictions on private businesses, privatized the state-owned firms, returned them to private ownership, required the Central Bank of Poland to focus on inflation. We're going to see a graph here in a minute that shows they had a big inflationary problem. He balanced the budget, which is a recurring theme through a number of these economies that moved from socialist back to market economies, was to balance their budget. And he put in a simplified and flattened tax system, which was one of the first in the world, remains today. I believe when it was established, it was a 10% flat tax, so that it was very simplified tax structure in Poland. I'm not sure if it's still at 10% today. I should have gone and done my homework. It's no more than 11 or 12, I believe, but I'm not sure. Okay, after transition to market democracy, again, a good surrogate for how's the economy doing is life expectancy. And you can see at 1992, that trend line turns upward and continues to go upward. That dark line at the bottom, if the current trend in the late 80s, early 90s had continued, you could expect a life expectancy line well below what it actually was by 2018. Here's the share of their population that's living on less than 600 or $6.85 per day. And you can see their darkest days were in fact back in 92, 93. The data 85, 86, 87. Not so sure about the data, but as best as it could be gathered. So you can see that 66%, 2/3 of the population is living on less than 685 per day. In 93, by 2019, it's dropped to 2%, 2.5% of the population. Tremendous economic gains over that period. Their GDP per capita, you can see how at 92 it takes off. Their GDP per capita is the red line. The blue line would be the projected trend line if they had not undertaken the economic reforms to move back to a capitalist country. You can see here in 1990, the inflation rate up to almost 600%, the annual inflation rate. And you can't even see the little red dots that are the developed economies of the West, their inflation rates over the same time. This kind of graph, the shape of it, is not uncommon with those Eastern Bloc countries, because as they moved in to 1988, 1989, 90, 91, and were given their own private or own countries, their own societies, the temptation to create money to address the lack of abundance for people was huge. And that was the case in part in Poland. And so subsequently, inflation got well out of control. But you saw that one of the primary things that Balcerowicz went after was inflation and to get that number down. So growth in the Polish incomes dramatically improved after the early 1990s transition from what would have been projected to 2018 at 14,000 is at actual 32,000. So more than double what you might have expected because they moved to away from socialism and toward a market-based economy. How do they finance it? We're going to see that that becomes a real question across some other countries. Here's how they finance the Polish government right now. Pension and payroll contributions, 38%. That, which is their sales tax, 35%. Remember in that survey with Debbie, you all didn't like the idea of a sales tax. We'll find that for most or much of the rest of the world, certainly the European countries and Eastern European countries, the sales tax is a very large portion of the national revenue, very much unlike the United States. And their income taxes were down at around 20%. But that's, again, because the sales tax, the VAT, is so high. So let me go back one. That's kind of a short history of Poland. What do we learn from that? Uh, we see the importance of the self-government, of the private property, the private ownership. It reestablishes incentives for innovation and invention. It reestablishes market prices that individuals can respond to. It lifts the control on individuals and moves us away from a totalitarian state. The Polish experience duplicated across most of those Eastern Bloc countries. Everybody's story is a little bit different, but very similar in the years following the demise of the Soviet Union. So what about other countries? You know, that's all well and good for the USSR and the countries that had to emerge from communism, from socialism, from totalitarian states, and the abuses to human rights, as well as abuses to the economy. But what about Sweden, Denmark, the Nordic countries? What about those? Uh, we're going to find that this word at the bottom here, abundance, is key. It's key to the story when it goes all the way back to Marx. It is key in the turnaround of Poland, the ability to begin to create abundance. And we're going to see that it plays an important role in why we turn and look at Sweden, Denmark, and other Nordic countries when we say socialism. And we're going to do that after we do a few more activities.